Hi everyone, it's Larry here. I wanted to put together a short video for you summarizing some of the key ideas from our creativity training a little over a month ago. I did that earlier and my short training turned out to be like 17 minutes, so I'm talking faster and condensing. So hi, hope everybody's doing great. Start my presentation here. So a couple of the key ideas from our training, one of them had to do with this notion that when the only tool you're good at is a hammer, you tend to see everything as a nail. And what that essentially means is that we have these fixed notions that have crept into us as an adult where we have very predictable ways of going about things. And creativity is when we reduce that predictability and we are more flexible and open in the way we approach things. So remember a couple of things we started with. One was that research on children and creativity and what happens to that. The other one is that comment from John Cleese who said, very difficult to be creative by trying to be creative. However, there are ways of thinking that the byproduct of thinking that way is we see things differently. So that's basically what we did a lot of. Also, the notion that the solution to every problem pre-exists and that finding it requires asking the right question. Just one thing I want to say about that is focusing on the problem is different than focusing on the solution. And when we're so focused on the problem and that's what we're drilling down into, we can't see outside of that, and that's where the solution exists. The other thing is solution is receptive, problem digging is transmitting. So asking questions, being open, being receptive. Remember we talked about the ways that people get creativity generally have to do with nature, walking, letting go, relaxing, etc. So just keep that in mind. Solution, solution thinking different than problem thinking. So the part of the key here was what John Cleese talked about with open systems, and I use that example of Albert Einstein because he had this brilliant mind, but he had the mind being able to do both things whenever it was appropriate. So one was critical, analytical, logical, sequential, step by step, and the other part was being in that creative open mind. He said he saw the theory of relativity in a flash, and then it took him years and years to come up with a way to prove it. So related to that is the open and closed system that Cleese talks about. Closed system is the one we're in most of the time, and that's characterized by multitasking, purposefulness, lots of stuff on our mind, logic, analytical driven, and so forth. Open system is when we get out of that and we have a less purposeful, more expansive, playful way of being. And that's the way of thinking, a way of being that creative people are when they get their ideas. So from there, perspective, everybody sees the world through their own eyes, and the more flexible you are, the different variety of things you experience. So that Yogi Berrism, you can notice an awful lot just by observing. So the perspective of Warner Brothers, this is something that we played during the training. That was a very limiting perspective. The perspective that the law of flotation wasn't discovered by studying the sinking of things. So again, that's the perspective of whatever issue you're working with. Motivation, you can study what's wrong or you can study what's right, what's working when it's there. We talked about that. And remember the perspective of what's half of 13 and how Einstein answered that from multiple perspectives. So let me just jump into some of the tools and remind you, my favorite and oftentimes one of the most useful things you can take from this is that whole idea about association, which means instead of thinking in a linear, predictable, analytical manner, you get out of that and you go into this associative mindset. So that's what we did when we were thinking about possible uses for cup, things that weigh less than a pound, things that have numbers on them. And we did a lot of different versions of that, including, excuse me, some of the physical stuff with improv. That's the notion of loosening up your thinking, looking at things from different perspective. A couple of the other things we did related to that, one of them is that forced connections. Take an animal, an object, a shoe, a cup of coffee, a rhinoceros, a bird feeder, and you brainstorm the attributes of that. So if we took banana and we were going to brainstorm the attributes of banana, they grow in clusters, environment has to be proper, climate has to be good, they're slick and slippery, they're nutritional, they help with the potassium with muscle, what have you. So then you take that list of attributes and you compare that to, and you kind of force that on whatever you're looking at. So if it's motivation, hiring process, running effective meetings, that's where the connections come in. The other thing is we get so micro that I use mind mapping to step back and look at the big picture. So if we were going to look at how to run meetings more effectively, that's the first thing we would do is warm up with an association, but then step back and look at the big picture. What are all the things that come into play that affect the outcome of the meeting? And that's the image I have here. That's the map, the big picture map of our entire day of training. And this actually could be 2 or 3 days of training. So that's one of the things we did. Einstein, all of life's answers are available if we just knew which questions to ask. So again, you can tell I'm really an advocate of hanging out with the questions. And when you hang out with the questions, solutions pop in. Different ways to state a problem. Why are we doing this? Why is this important? Phrasing it in the way of, in what ways can I improve or make this better? So again, that questioning mindset. And again, the aha and the duh. That we've all wrestled with issues, we've worked on them, and all of a sudden, out of the blue, this answer comes in, and when it comes in, it's like, aha, and immediately followed by a duh, because now that it's so crystal clear, it's like, I'm wondering why in the heck couldn't I see that earlier? So when we went to the discussion on employee motivation, then that's one of the ways we step back and let's do association. Let's look at it as if it's working. Let's look at the big picture. Let's map it out. If we wanted to make it worse, how would we make it worse? Those are all types of thinking that we can use to keep us from focusing in too narrowly. And then we start harvesting a lot of different perspectives and possibilities. So just going to remind you, pick the ones that really spoke to you during the training and keep that alive. Keep using that. So motivation, we played with that a lot. I put this diagram together. This is in your material of how do we take these ideas and use them to practice creativity. So I made this short map with some ideas and suggestions on, take whatever issue you're working with. The first thing on here is warm up with some sort of a gush or association and so forth. And as a part of this process, one of the indication that you're being more creative and looking at things flexible and playfully is the degree of playfulness and humor that's involved. That's always an indicator. Once you get your ideas together, they're only useful if you can do something with them. So that's where the fish diagram came in. And just to summarize that, on the right-hand side of this image with the coffee cup, that's the outcome. That's what we're working toward. And then the skeleton of the fish becomes, what are the primary attributes? What is it that's contributing to that? So here's the outcome that we're working on, the focus on the key issue. And then what are the major causes that contribute to that? So, time, money, resources, training, etc. And then underneath each one of those major causes, you put down the minor things. So, one of these branches could be, if we're talking about effective meetings, could be agenda or location or time, having the right people there. So the diagram is a way to take all of that brainstorming and put it into some kind of a useful context. Finally, like this image, this is kind of the terrain I grew up in. We had a sod house out in the pasture where I grew up in Kansas. So perspective, you can find yourself in the middle of nowhere, or in the middle of nowhere you can find yourself. So let me just say it was great to work with you. I wanted to put together some kind of a short, brief reminder. And if I was going to suggest one thing, if you have not had time or taken the time to use those associations, go back to that. Some way, some capacity to keep that mind loose and limber and adaptable and flexible on a day-to-day basis. And that way you have that ability accessible to you when you need it. So it was great to work with you. Hopefully I'll see you down the road somewhere on another project. Just wishing you the best. Bye.